Yeah, see, the history of the mob, or as we call it, Cosa Nostra. These guys, they're secretive, always playing it close to the vest. They don't keep records or write down their story. Nah, they prefer to spread lies, create myths, and sometimes even start believing themselves. It's all part of the game, the smoke and mirrors that keeps them in power. It all started back in the 19th century, in Sicily, when the island was going through some major changes. Feudalism was on its way out, and capitalism was taking hold. The nobility, them landowners, had their private armies and courts keeping law and order in their own hands. But things were about to change. The land was sold off to private citizens, primogeniture was abolished, and suddenly there were thousands of new landowners. With all these new owners, disputes started popping up left and right. Contracts needed enforcement, transactions needed oversight, and properties needed protection. The old barons, they let the state take over the law enforcement gig, but the government just wasn't up to the task. Clash between official law and local customs didn't help matters either. And let me tell you, the manpower was lacking too. Just a few hundred cops trying to keep the peace on the whole damn island. So, what happened next? Banditry, my friend. The desperate peasants turned to stealing to survive. In those small towns where the law was practically non-existent, local elites took matters into their own hands. They formed these companies their arms made up of former bandits and criminals, the toughest and most skilled among them. These companies would hunt down thieves, negotiate the return of stolen property, and in return, get a fee and pardon for the thieves. It was a win-win, at least for the elites and the protectors. See, these companies at arms often colluded with their former brethren rather than destroy them. They found common ground in the world of crime. It's not the mafia, it was mostly a Western Sicilian thing. The East had its own ways of dealing with things. The ruling elites in the East were stronger, more cohesive. They had their own enforcers and could suppress any uppers and groups. Plus, the land in the East was owned by fewer large estates, which required full-time guardians. The owners had to hire protection. But in the West, the estates were smaller, and it was cheaper to contract protection from a mafioso. These guys could cover multiple estates, giving them leverage and independence. The landowners in the West were often absent, so the mafiosi held all the cards. The early mafia found its footing in industries like citrus and cattle. Citrus plantations were vulnerable to sabotage, and cattle was easy to steal. The mafia became better at recovering stolen cattle than the police themselves. It was a business, protection in exchange for a cut. The landowners needed them, and the mafia thrived. See, it all started back in 1864. Niccolo Turcicolana, leader of the Palermo National Guard, wrote about this sect of thieves operating throughout Sicily. They were a bunch of ruthless characters, mostly rural folks, cattle thieves, smugglers, and even wealthy farmers. They had their own code, their own signals, and they believed they were untouchable. The thing about these guys is that they didn't just stick to their criminal activities. No, they meddled in politics too. They bullied voters, influenced elections, and controlled a significant chunk of the electorate. With the fragile Italian political system of the time, politicians with mafia connections had real power. Fast forward to the late 1800s, and the mafia was thriving. The police chief of Palermo, Ormano Sangiorgi, identified hundreds of mafiosi belonging to different clans. These guys had initiation rituals, codes of conduct, and were involved in all sorts of criminal activities. They counterfeited, kidnapped for ransom, killed, robbed, and intimidated witnesses. They even took care of their imprisoned members' families and paid for their defense lawyers. But you know what happened next? The Italian government decided to crack down on the mafia. They thought they could wipe them out. So in 1898, Italian troops arrested dozens of people in Palermo. The trial began in 1901, but only a fraction of the defendants were found guilty. It was a setback for the government's anti-mafia efforts. Now, here's an interesting twist. Some studies suggest that the emergence of the Sicilian mafia was linked to a resource curse. Sicily had abundant sulfur, a valuable export commodity at the time, and that created opportunities for the mafia to exploit. Weak law enforcement and a valuable resource became a breeding ground for organized crime. And it wasn't just sulfur. The demand for oranges and lemons also played a role. Then came Mussolini. In 1925, he launched a campaign to destroy the mafia and establish fascist control over Sicily. The mafia posed a threat to his power, so he wanted to crush them. He appointed Cesare Mori as the prefect of Palermo and gave him special powers to fight the mafia. Mori went from town to town, rounding up suspects and using brutal tactics to force confessions. Mussolini's campaign was brutal, but it did suppress the mafia. The murder rate dropped and landowners regained control over their lands. Many mafiosi fled to other countries like Canada and the United States, where they continued their criminal activities. But you know what happened after World War? Chaos and upheaval. Allied troops invaded Sicily and crime skyrocketed. The black market thrived and banditry returned. In the midst of all this, the Mafia found opportunities to rebuild their power base, shifting from rural to urban areas. The changing economic landscape and political reforms posed challenges for the Mafia. They murdered socialist reformers and tried to stop the land reforms. But in the end, they couldn't prevent progress, and many landowners ended up selling their lands to the Mafia. Then, in the 1950s, the crackdown on drug trafficking in the United States led to the imprisonment of many American mafiosi. They needed new alliances, and that's when Joseph Bonanno came into the picture. He established the Sicilian Mafia Commission to mediate disputes and expand their drug operations. And that's just a glimpse into the complex history of the Sicilian Mafia.